So good day. We're very grateful to be here, and particularly with each other, good friends.
Yes, it's such a beautiful opportunity to spend a few days together.
And we're here to explore.
We're here to explore because first we have a very distinguished Dharma teacher who will introduce herself in a minute.
And a very distinguished climate diplomat who will introduce herself in a minute.
But we will, taking advantage of the fact that we're together, we would like to explore with you some of the many overlaps between our efforts on climate change, or for that matter, on biodiversity loss or any of the other global issues that we're facing, and our understanding of the real reality, because we may delude ourselves by thinking that which we see with our physical eyes is reality. And in fact, there is another reality that we can awaken to. So we would like to explore that overlap. But first, Roshi Joan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you. So I'm Roshi Joan Halifax, abbot of Upaya Zen Center, author, social and environmental activist, and most joyfully here in Costa Rica, actually, this very day, in a country without a standing army and many other virtues, sitting next to my good friend, Christiana Figueres, who is the descendant of the president of Costa Rica, who actually transformed the policies, the climate, the environment, and the mindset of this country. Christiana.
So I'm Christiana Figueres. Yes, I am the proud daughter of an amazing, amazing Costa Rican citizen who created what we call modern Costa Rica. But I am also, many years after that, I have been interested in working on climate change since the 1990s, which means I've been at it for what, 30 something years? Good Lord. And halfway through that, discovered the teachings of Buddhism, and have found that those teachings, in my case, because I discovered the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, I found that these teachings on applied or engaged Buddhism have been so literally life-saving for me, and nourishing and supportive. They have held me through many, many difficult moments, months, years in the efforts on climate. And so I just find that they're incredibly helpful. And that's what we want to explore today.
And I think Christiana and I both reflect women's view as well, what it is to be a woman in the world today, and to be working in very complex systems, whether it is the political systems that Christiana touches, or for me, the medical systems that I interact with, or even the religious systems that I interact with. And one of the things that we really feel is important for us to unwrap today in this rare opportunity of us being together.
We should make it less rare, by the way.
Yes, I agree. And actually, we have to plan that as soon as possible so it doesn't slip off our social radar. You know, there are many beliefs, views, and mindsets that mitigate possibility. And this is something that Christiana and I encounter every day in the work that we do as social and environmental activists, and as people who are interacting inside of systems that are very fraught. We want to touch into those views, mindsets, and myths in this conversation between us, because we feel, you know, in this time, it's important to make transparent how we are actually tied up in a kind of knot without a rope by seeing out of the wrong lens, or lens that is deeply biased and socially bound. So, Christiana, I'd like us to begin, first of all, with this notion, the myth that you hear, and doomerism is epidemic. What can we do about the myth that we are doomed, that there are no options, that all possibilities actually do not lead to an end to this crisis. Even applying the best technology or a kind of global mindset transformation. How do we address this myth of doomerism? And what do you see as not
as the option to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think it has become a little bit too prevalent or a little bit too popular to take on these doomistic or doomeristic views. And I think that is incredibly dangerous. It is exactly as dangerous as being a climate denier, because what this doomism does to us is it paralyzes our capacity to do anything about it. It paralyzes our ingenuity, our agency, and we fall into this very deep hole of helplessness and hopelessness if we really buy into the myth of doom. Now, we do have to understand that there is a possibility that we will not address climate change in a timely fashion. That is a very real possibility, but it is a little bit like, if anybody here is old enough to remember those TV shows that they said door number one, door number two. I'm old enough, and the reality is that right now we are facing two paths. One is a path of continuing the kinds of actions, decisions, investments that we have been having for the past decades. And if we do nothing about that and we just slide with the business as usual, then we do get, by the end of this decade, to a very dangerous point in which there will be tipping points in nature that are irreversible. And we would never be able to reverse them. And they actually cascade onto one another. So that is the, let's say, the antecedent to the doom that many people are assuming is our only possibility. But the fact is that we have door number two, which is what we are working toward, and gratefully so many millions of other people are working toward. And that is the door number two is to cut our emissions in time such that by the end of this decade, we can not just avoid the worst of climate change, but actually, and this is the exciting part, open. It's like a portal that we would go through into a much better world that is more just, first, very important, more healthy, more efficient, much more aware of our surroundings. So what we do have to understand here from a practice and a Buddhist point of view is the relationship between what we think, the relationship between our thoughts, our mindsets, our beliefs, and the reality that we create, because we do co-create our reality. If we assume that our reality is untouchable, that we can't influence it, then we have very little recourse. But if we understand that actually we do have an influence, not a control, but an influence on the direction in which we move, now we can explore our agency. All the while, Roshi Joan has been teaching me for the past 2 years that we cannot be attached to an outcome. We cannot assume that, yes, of course, we're going to be successful in this, because the fact is, just like doom is not a reality, success is also not a guarantee. And so we have to go at this with all our capacity, with all our ingenuity, in full acceptance of the fact that there is uncertainty about the future, that everything is impermanent. The only permanent thing there is impermanence, and that we can influence for sure, but that we cannot control. That is, to me, the most difficult part of this.
Well, I think that what you're saying not only reflects a Buddhist perspective, but it's completely reality-based, I have to say. I think another aspect of this, Christiana, that's very important is how we develop a tolerance for the inconceivable. The capacity to have the imagination, to actually live in such a way where surprise is our ally, not a threat to our identity. And to also have the imagination to actually invent past just technology, but in terms of mindset, to be able to invent a new way of operating as global communities in relation to the context of our lived experience, which is the natural world. And to understand the natural world is not a resource to be extracted,
exploited,
and exploited and turned into a commodity, but actually is the very source of our life. So, you know, the transformation of mindset is, of course, this is what one does in Buddhist practice. It's mind training. It's learning how to, you know, allocate our attention in such a way that we have attentional balance and can perceive reality clearly. And what's happened, of course, is that with high distractibility through our many devices and the pushes and pulls in our work and social world, we have in a certain way become toxically ungrounded. And so why I think practice is so important is that it gives us certain skills to see reality clearly and in a way lovingly, but also fiercely, and to not buy into the mindset of futility, not buy into or be influenced in the grip of or be a toy of doomerism per se.
Yeah, we're so anchored in the past that we continuously obsess about the past and assume that the future is just going to be a repetition of the past or the consequence of the present, and that is not necessarily so, right? The future holds all possibilities, the full gamut of possibilities. And the more we open ourselves to that uncertainty, to that full gamut of possibilities, the richer the experience. And frankly, the closer it is to reality. It's only in our infinite dumb little wisdom, right, that we assume that there are only a few possibilities in the future. That is just not so.
Well, thank you. That leads us to myth number 2. So, Christiana, you know, out of doomerism comes myth number 2. And that second myth is really important, and that for us to touch into. And the myth is, the story is, the narrative is, I, as an individual, can do nothing. I have nothing to contribute. I have no agency. My vote doesn't count. My voice doesn't count.
My actions don't
My
count.
actions don't count. What do you say to that, Christiana?
I think you're the master
No,
of
no,
this.
no, no. I want you to begin.
Well, first, I think that we have to realize that given how late we are in addressing these issues, that nothing that we can individually do now is going to be enough. So let's start with that humility. Nothing is enough. And it's not a but, and everything counts. That's the piece that is really important to understand, that every action, every decision, every investment into which technologies, every measure that we take at home, every conversation that we have with our family, friends, and neighbors, everything counts, because everything that we do as individuals is actually fertilizing the space of possibility that is in maybe in a process of maturation, to be able to see a new reality emerge from it. And so while it is understandable that we feel that we as individuals are not going to make the dramatic difference, true, but each of us can have an influence. And here's the beauty of it: the collection of us, collectively, we, perhaps written with a big W, a capital W, it's in our hands. We have actually caused this problem. We humans have caused climate change. And hence, it is only we humans who can actually get ourselves out of it. in a timely fashion. So the relationship between my actions, my thoughts, my beliefs, and the impact of the system as a whole is one that we really have to nourish almost on a daily basis, and not have the little idea that what I do is only going to stay here. Think of it a little bit as throwing a little stone into a pond. It's only a little stone, but you throw it into the pond and it ripples all the way to the shores. So think about it that way. We do have a ripple effect. And that's why it's really important to have the right ripple effect and not the wrong ripple effect, because we can also have wrong ripple effects. We can also be agents of doom, as we've just discussed, or we can be agents of possibility.
You know, I was thinking about Han Shan, the Chinese poet whom many of us cherish. Ancient China, Han Shan leaves his, civil servant job, retreats to the wilderness, scratches his poems on trees and rocks and on cave walls. And then 1,000 years later, a hippie guy up in a fire watch tower begins to read the poetry of Han Shan. And out of that, Gary Snyder's incredible inspiration from Han Shan was born the vision of deep ecology. And Han Shan had no attachment to outcome. Han Shan had no idea that downstream 1,000 years, there would be this movement that is global, that has expressed itself also in Thich Nhat Hanh's extraordinary views and visions of interbeing, that we are not separate from the actual natural world, from the context of our lived experience. And it was in a moment in this rare wilderness of the Western United States in a fire watchtower that this young poet, Gary Snyder, had this realization. Now, Václav Havel said very much the same thing. We do it just because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And if you look at Buddhist precepts, and it's like sometimes I say, why not be a Buddha now? Don't wait, until you're on your deathbed or your next lifetime. No matter how complicated your life is, how often you've gone off the roll, how doomeristic you might have been, fraught with depression and futility. Why not show up now? And so, it is why. Because this is where it is at. Yeah. It is in this present moment.
Yeah, this is it.
Ty talks about the miracle of this moment, even in the midst of war. As I look at the photographs of these soldiers in Ukraine, embracing their girlfriends, or, walking with, in these horrid, tragic circumstances, with some kind of light coming from their eyes. As much as I am anti-war and deeply anti-violent, I also understand, even in the midst of the worst conditions of war, of a catastrophic diagnosis, of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, pulling this child from the wreckage 150 hours after the quake happened, even in the midst, you do it just because it's the right thing to do. Because Han Shan had no idea. That child, in that rubble, wrapped in concrete, those who dug for this little baby, again, you have no idea what the outcome will be, but you do it because it's the right thing to do.
Because it's the right thing to do at that moment.
At that moment, yeah.
And that brings me, Roshi, to the other, concept that I've been slowly learning, which is moving beyond the concept of my lifespan, to really understand that, yes, my lifespan or anybody else's lifespan is a reality. And we use each other's lifespan as a point of reference when so-and-so lived, or when I'm alive, or, and while we are here on this planet, as Roshi, as you've just said, our calling, our duty, our our opportunity is to do the right thing just because it's the right thing right now that we're alive. And at the same time, without contradicting that, understand that we're one link in a long chain, and that there is a much, much longer and a much higher sense of time, of reality that we're a part of, but that is not limited by us, by our human lifespans. And so to understand that those realities, actually, we can hold them in equal standing, and they do not contradict each other. So to those who say it's too late to do anything about climate anyway, or about biodiversity anyway, no, it's not too late, because we can still do the right thing right now. And
or what I do doesn't count.
Or what I do doesn't count. Exactly. And I know that we will not address climate change during my lifespan. It will take a longer time to be able to do this if we do it. But whatever we do now is absolutely critical. So those two senses of time or of reality do not contradict each other. They're not mutually exclusive. They are part and parcel of this much more complex being that we have, not a being, but a complex being. The fact that we are here to be, in addition to being here to do. And it is in that be space that we realize that those two senses of time actually coincide.
Another thing I think that is quite challenging is that so many allocate responsibility to the system, and they actually take the role of victim, if you will, to the system, and that mitigates our own sense of engagement, our own sense understanding of responsibility, and also mitigates meaning.
Yes.
Ends meaning in our life.
Absolutely.
And so, this allocation, yes, there are systemic issues. There is structural violence. There's institutional violence. There's direct violence coming, from the hands, if you will, of many different kinds of institutions in our societies, not just our society. But we have to understand also that just because the system is, not in our favor, so to speak, it doesn't mean that we don't step forward in any case. And I often think in this regard about Nelson Mandela. He took in his young years a very direct approach to confronting the system of apartheid, and he ended up 41 years in Robben Island, incarcerated, humiliated, tramped down, and going through this powerful transformation process, where upon his release, and he ended up being, the president of South Africa, and also ending apartheid and inviting his jailer, if you will, to the inaugural dinner to sit at the table with him. So, these transformations are possible. We see the transformation of the system. Now apartheid is back. The truth of impermanence prevails. We don't know. The Berlin Wall came down. We don't know. 50 years ago, maybe the Exxon knew, what would be the situation in relation to the effect on our atmosphere of
oil and gas.
We didn't know, but the corporations did, and they had basically a capitalistic, materialistic, very life-denying program engaged. Now, what is very interesting, Christiana, maybe you can gently address this, is the oil and gas industry, certain sectors of it are beginning to shift in terms of their view and values.
Yeah. Beginning, I think, is the underlying.
Yeah. Well, you're helping that.
I wouldn't say that there has been dramatic shift there, but they're beginning to shift. And honestly, I think there are a couple of reasons why. The most direct and evident is because they know that we are already today in a carbon constrained reality, and that they do not have eternity for their products. And so they might as well begin to shift, because their products are not going to be in demand in the future. In fact, there are already many statistics that show that the demand for oil and gas has already peaked and is beginning to go down, interestingly enough. And even more interestingly, that trajectory was accelerated by the Russian invasion in Ukraine that sent these resources prices are skyrocketing high, and therefore people don't want to buy those resources because they're so expensive. But in any event, so the oil and gas companies have understood that they don't have an elastic time for their oil and gas, and that they need to move over so that they can continue in business. Of course they're interested in business continuity. But here's the very fun thing. They're also moving over because they need the best brains out there on the market. And the best brains in the market are not the brains in these bodies, these aged bodies. The best brains are always in the heads of young people. And young people today do not want to sell their brains to companies that are being irresponsible environmentally or socially. I work with many young people who come to me to, prepare for a job interview. And what is really fun is that I'm always expecting them to want to rehearse some answers to very predictable interview questions. No, many of them say, Christiana, can you help us think of really good, incisive questions that we can ask the companies so that we know if they're really serious about the environment and about social issues? Whoa, tables are turning. Tables are turning. And the oil and gas companies know that they do not compete anymore for the best and brightest minds unless they begin their shift. So that's really, I believe that we're witnessing right now a shift that is not a clear shift. All transitions are muddy. And in any transition, you will find proof points of both the past and the future. And in the present, which is a very, very complicated transition, you will find proof points of both an intensive oil and gas and coal reality, as well as proof points of a clean electricity and a regenerated nature. You'll find proof points there. So we're in this in-between and middle point that is really interesting, and I think very exciting, quite a privilege, honestly, and an honor for all of us to be alive right now in this amazing, amazing transition. Because just think about it, Roshi, your parents and my parents didn't know anything about climate change. They didn't have the technologies, they didn't have the science, certainly the capital wasn't available, so they could not have made any difference. And my children, who are now in their early 30s, by the time they're my age, which will be 30 years from now, it will be too late, because the big divide is 2030. That's when we're going to divide. Which way are we going? Door number one, door number two. So if it was too early for my parents, they didn't have the knowledge, the science, the technologies, and collectively the capital as a society, and it's going to be too late for my kids, guess who's sandwiched in between? All of us now, who are full adults, who are sitting at decision tables, who are influencing thinking. It is our sacred responsibility to ensure that we do everything we can to move the trajectory toward door number two, because we are the ones that are deciding that. And just to close the loop with the Mandela example, how and just recently, Roshi Joan, you and I were exposed to a person who, and I honestly, I think it's just exemplary of many people who think the system is so evil and it is so terrible that it cannot be changed. Well, would you say the same thing about individuals? Would you say that an individual who has been traumatized is doomed to be traumatized his or her whole life? Would you say that anyone who has had a difficult childhood is doomed to tragedy their whole life? We don't say that because we hold the possibility of healing and of peace and of transformation for every individual. So if we hold that possibility for an individual, why don't we hold it for the system? It's the same thing. Whatever is present at one level of the system is present at all other levels. So just because the system has been hijacked by a particular industry or by a particular mindset, extractive thinking, extractive policies, extractive invasiveness, does not mean that that is the only reality that we're going to have in the future. If you've been traumatized, you can heal and regenerate. If you've been extracted as a society and as an economy, you can heal that and regenerate. Do not operate with a mindset of scarcity and impossibility at any level, all the way from the individual to the system.
And I so appreciate what my wonderful late teacher said, do not cultivate a mind of poverty in yourself and others. I also think about what your father did in Costa Rica by ending the military, the standing army. But I want us just to take a breath right now, because this is something that is key to how Christiana offers her wisdom and her energy to the world, and also how I sustain myself and offer whatever I can in the world by that capacity to stop, to pause, and to remember really why we're here, which is to be of benefit to all beings and to stabilize our attention and to remember who we really are. And as you said, Christiana, this is a sacred time that we are in. It's a moment in a kind of global rite of passage where we are being separated in a certain way from the world that we knew and thrashed apart. We're on the threshold, watching systems change, emerge, disappear. Ecological systems, political systems, individual systems. I mean, the truth of impermanence is one thing that we can count on. So in this sacred time, I think it's good for us to look at myth number 3, which is, we know how this is going to turn out. We know what's going to happen. We know what's down the road. Christiana, what is your reflection on that myth and its effect on us?
Well, it's so interesting because I think that belief divides people in the sense that there are many technology, not even technology happy, technology trusting people who feel that technology is going to get us out of this. And one technology that is always brought up is carbon capture and sequestration. And some of the oil and gas companies feel if they can develop that and make it commercially viable, then that's going to be the solution, or there's air capture, or there's so many technologies that are still nascent, but that there's a belief that that technology is going to be the technological fix. Without understanding that what we're seeing in the natural world is only the tip of the iceberg of what is happening underneath, and that a technological fix at the top does not affect what is happening underneath. And so those, who put their 100% trust in technology, and I trust technology, but not for 100% of the transformation. It has to be there also. But the transformation is a much deeper transformation. It's how do we relate to each other? Well, first of all, how do I relate to myself? How do we relate to each other? How do we relate to everyone else on this planet and to all other sentient beings on this planet? That is the rich tapestry that needs this transformation. And then, of course, technology can help us as well. But then there are others on the other extreme that don't believe in any of the virtues of technology or of any other transformation, and are just so fixated, as we were talking before, about this is just it. This is it. There are many young people, an increasing number of young people who are in their 20s who call themselves the last generation. The last generation. I mean, honestly, it just, every time I think about that, and my eyes are tearing up again now, because I just think that is so sad. That is so sad that you grow up and you're a 20-something-year-old and you are convinced that you are the last generation of human species on this planet. It's just tremendously sad. And it's because they have, swallowed, how do you say it in English? Hook, sinker, what is that called?
Hook, line, and sinker.
That one. Hook, line, and sinker, thank you. This science projection, which is only a projection in the future. It is not, science is not saying this is what is going to happen. Science is saying this could happen if we do not do our job. But they don't hear the if we don't do our job. They just assume that these terrible projections of human misery and physical destruction and cascading tipping points are the only possibility that we have. And so they rob themselves of the capacity to contribute to a transformation, and thereby rob themselves of the possibility of transforming themselves, their own mindset, their own engagement. How we show up in the world is hugely important. And that is a daily choice. Because yes, there are mostly bad news items every single day. That is for sure, because the media feeds on bad news. It's not that there's more bad news than good. It's that bad news sells better than good. And so when you read or hear or whatever, the news, it seems like there's only bad news. And you wake up in the morning and you can be like overwhelmed by this. And reach, very quickly the conclusion, I am a part of the last generation. They're not. They're a wonderful generation. They have, so many more skills than we have. And Roshi, Joan, and I have been just spending a few days with these amazing young people who are much brighter than we are, who have many more skills than we have, who are developing tools that are absolutely beyond anything that we could possibly imagine. Thank heavens. So there is a lot of possibility, but we have to get out of the self-curtailing mindset that paralyzes any capacity of having agency.
So I think one of the disabling aspects is the experience of moral injury. When we see systems, corporations, people, nations engaged in activities that are degrading of all of life, our values are threatened, our existence is threatened, but also the sense of our very personhood in an embedded world, in the world of interbeing, is deeply threatened. And there's the experience of disgust, because we recognize in some way we also have contributed to this dispositive situation that the world is in. And yet we don't want to take responsibility and engage in actions in the sense that we were speaking about earlier. And moral injury to our values, injury to our sense of humanity disables us and moves us into profound futility. So you're seeing this not just in older people. Christiana, you've talked about pre-trauma suffering. Before the really bad stuff happens, people are already suffering. It's like anticipatory grief. And again, coming back, we have the human resources to actually change the tide of futility and also of destruction in our time. I mean, it's just like, yes, but it's so interesting, as Christiana is suggesting, our media feeds us food, if you will, that we take into our psyche that violates our sense of goodness in the world. And as a result of that, our sense of agency is disabled.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is really important in this regard is to understand the relationship between the individual and the system. We are the system. We affect the system. Mandela affected the system. You, Christiana, affected the system. When I entered the end-of-life care field many decades ago, my imperative, my deep inner imperative from working in a medical school where people who were giving care to dying people were suffering sometimes more than the dying people, was how can we change the culture of medicine? And what Christiana and I both are dedicated to is to working at the systemic level, but also at the individual level.
Because they're one and the same.
They are one and the same. We realize they are reflections of each other.
Yeah.
And so your brightness and determination, your capacity to show up in the midst of very complex conditions, but also to mobilize positive energy and to get people who are operating out a sense of aversion to difference to appreciation of difference.
Yes.
Which I think is so important in the kind of work that you do. And in this regard, I want to go to a question that was asked of us, and it has to do with listening. Which I find you one of the most adept listeners I've ever experienced. I really feel heard when we're communicating with each other, though you don't always agree. Until later. No. But I'd love to just ask you to, speak to your experience of listening to people and in situations that are radically different, hold radically different views than you, even views that you consider from the point of view of values and of your vision are in conflict with what you really care about. How do you do that?
I'm not sure how everybody else does it, but I can speak.
I'm saying you.
I can speak from the little experience that I'm still trying to deepen. And I think in order to deeply listen, the first step, even before going into listening mode, is to go into let go mode internally. Because if I hold on, let's say we're talking about, I don't know, what can we be talking about? Who's responsible for climate change? That's a really good question. Who's responsible and who should do something about it? And so I happen to have a view about that. You may have a view, you may have a view, but the point is, if we actually need, and we usually do, to come to some common ground that does not need to be identical to each other, but to common ground where we can work with each other on a topic, then listening to each other is critical. And before listening to each other is letting go of my stand and identifying what is my stand on this issue. It can be whatever it is. And then letting it go. And know that it is a stand there, that it is somebody's opinion, in this case, my opinion, and maybe somebody else's in the circle opinion, but it's only an opinion. And that when you let go, and that's really difficult because when you're in a conversation with someone, you're always like at it from, from your piece, and you hold on to that. And so let go and understand that okay, I have an opinion about that. Fine. It is an opinion. And then be in a much more open, neutral listening mode to understand that everyone is speaking from their own point of view, imbued by the experiences they've had, the history, their education, their culture, their nations, their religious or spiritual or lack thereof practices. There's so many different factors that affect people's position or stand on any topic. And think about it as this big whirling machine inside each of us. And then all of that, or you can think about it as a kaleidoscope, okay? A kaleidoscope that has all of these different colors and shapes and everything. And then you look for one thing and there is something in focus. But that focus is the result of everything else. And that is how we express our positions, except when we express a position, we don't go through the whole kaleidoscopic analysis. We just say, I believe that, or the right thing to do is. And as we listen, we have to understand that the right thing to do is statement comes from a wide variety of factors that are influencing that. And therefore, it is not necessarily a completely unchangeable position or opinion. And once you have everybody's opinion or position on the table, and if you're listening really with an open heart, knowing that yourself, you only have an opinion, then it's actually quite magical, because then you begin to see that all of this listening, if you're really doing it sincerely, all of this listening on its own, it's almost magic. It's emergence of figure is what a Gestalt psychologist would call it. But it begins to congeal, and you begin to see one idea or two or three that are emerging that everybody can go like, well, it's not exactly my position, but I could live with that. Yeah, I can agree with that, because it has been nourished by everything that came before. So everybody can see a part of them and a part of what is important to them reflected in that. And that is just such a magical process. But that it does really need, the first step is to step out of your own straitjacket, and assume that my straitjacket, my opinion, my position, my viewpoint is the right one, and just leave it aside. And then there's magic that happens. There's magic that happens because we humans begin to gravitate toward our common humanity. And the common humanity goes way deeper than our personal experiences, our cultural background, the color of our passport, our education, our parents, whatever training of us, all of that. We begin to gravitate naturally, toward our common humanity. And that's where there's common ground. And it's a beautiful process.
When you were speaking, I was really turning inside toward my own teacher, classman Roshi, who used to quote the Big Lebowski, and he'd say, "It's just your opinion, man."
Yeah.
And he would just bring everything to a standstill. He'd just cut through and say, "Just your opinion, man." But something else that Bernie shared, and his late wife Jishu, that I think is really important here, and it's the 3 tenets. And when Bernie shared these 3 tenets with me in the mid-90s, I was working as a volunteer in the penitentiary system, and also sitting with dying people and training clinicians and doing all kinds of activist work and working in Nepal and so on. Also, building our Zen center. When he shared these 3 tenets, I went, oh. So those tenets are radical. And the first we've addressed, it's the tenet of not knowing, how to be in beginner's mind, how to listen without the filter of one's opinions and biases, with one's knowing, actually making it impossible for people not only to, enter our experience, but to hear themselves as they speak, and to hear each other as they're in exchange. And not knowing also has to do with, how we evaluate our experience, instead of applying signs and labels and categories and boxes to what is happening. It is having the courage and imagination just to be absolutely open to what is in this moment, without the conceptual mind articulating a model or frame of reference, which this is a model, by the way, but nonetheless, frame of reference, which actually narrows possibilities. And the second tenet is bearing witness, and it's not being a bystander. Actually, in bearing witness, it actually refers it from the Buddhist frame of reference to the experience of samadhi, of deep connectedness, of not separating from you, Christiana, in your energy and your joy and your optimism and your beauty, but also not separating from the truth of suffering as it is.
Yes.
And, because you cannot take responsibility if you do not touch the truth of suffering as it is, or you cannot be uplifted, as I am so often in interacting with my good friend here. Bearing witness allows us or gives us the ground for non-separation. And out of not knowing and bearing witness, the third is loving action or compassionate action. So not knowing and bearing witness are absolutely fundamental as precursors or the ground from which we engage. And in this regard, I developed this very interesting approach to cultivating compassion while we're interacting with others, but can be used in all sorts of contexts other than medical. It's used primarily in medical settings, but in education or in protest situation. And it's grace, and it's the power of gathering one's attention. How do we actually ground ourselves in this moment as it is, instead of being upregulated and losing, finding ourselves in the grip of dispersion, really primed by fear or anxiety and such. And what are our intentions? So it's recalling our intention, our intention to really be of benefit. And then the A of grace is the capacity to actually attune to our own subjective experience, our body, our emotions, our views, and then to be in an empathic relationship with the other, being in connection. And listening really allows, in the way that Christiana is talking about this, allows this to happen. The Sea of Grace is consider what will serve. And, it's this pause that is so important that Thai teaches, that so well. Instead of jumping, it's going deep, seeing deeply the truth of whatever the situation is presenting to one, and then responding. And then the E of Grace is engaging, and then, of course, completion, ending. So, I think both Christiana and I feel the deep value of what it is to sit with, a very open mind in the midst of complex conditions, to really drop into not knowing. But the irony, of course, is that our value at the social level is often predicated on our knowing.
Yeah.
You know, and people's egos
And our doing.
and do our knowing and doing, and people's egos are so, you know, knitted into the knowing and the doing.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting to actually work as a practice with opening up again and again to this very fresh way of being in the present moment.
So I have bad news for you now.
Yeah, I know, we just ran out of time. Oh, what is that?
Our cup of time runneth over.
It has.
Very much so.
So I think we have to complete.
I think so.
Ending
too.
is ending.
Sadly.
But it's been wonderful interacting with everybody today through this medium, but mostly with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshi.
Thank you, dear Christiana.
Thank you, everyone.